Thank you, Ted, for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure.
It's great to have you as one of the best heels in World Wrestling Federation history. Probably really started off really good storylines for some of the villains. And I personally watched you growing up and loved your shtick. I thought it was great.
Okay.
And so you've been in wrestling pretty much your whole life. You were born into it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but it was actually your mom who was a wrestler as well.
Well, yeah, yes, my father was a wrestler, and I had a lot of friends like, I'm very close to the Hart family, and have been all my life because they, like me, grew up in a wrestling family.
Yeah, that's it.
Stu Hart was their dad. Mike DiBiase was my dad.
I was going to say Iron Mike was your dad.
And I think for guys like us who grew up in the business, we had a natural taste for it, a natural love for it, and of course, wanting to follow in the footsteps of my dad. My dad was not only a professional wrestler. 1946, he was the AAU National Heavyweight Wrestling Champion in the United States, and so that's an amateur wrestler as well. And then I think he had an offer from the Buffalo Bills to play professional football, but at that time, he could make more money being a professional wrestler than he could playing professional football.
That's amazing to hear, because that would have been the early days, the 60s of the NFL.
Yep.
And it's funny you mentioned the Hart family, because both you and Brett are known as some of the best technical wrestlers out there, and it seems like that came from that amateur wrestling background.
Yeah, what was funny is and I really wish that I had the opportunity to have, in the business we call it a program. In other words, an opportunity for Brett and I to wrestle each other for a couple of months, like in a storyline.
Yep.
But that never happened, unfortunately. But we wrestled. I think they used to call this. They would do these matches at our TV shows that were what they said were for Coliseum video. And so they told Brett and I, they said, we want you guys to go out and do a 20-minute match we call it a Broadway. In other words, 20 minutes and it's a draw, nobody wins. And so we went out, and this is the first time Brett and I had ever been in the ring together.
That's awesome.
And we had this match, and when we came out, one of the guys that was like Vince McMahon's right-hand man, now I'm brain dead. He was a wrestler too. Anyway, he was Vince's guy, and he had been a very successful wrestler himself. Dang it, who am I thinking of? Thank you, Pat O'Connor.
Yeah,
and
I love that you know.
And so he looks at us and he says, "Gosh, that was awesome, guys. You guys must have been wrestling each other a lot." And we just looked at each other and then looked back at him and said, "Pat, that's the first time we ever touched." And basically, it was just because, Brett and I both grew up in the professional wrestling culture, and I would say even old school, the old school way. That's the thing that disappoints me about wrestling today is that I actually think the girls' division of the WWE put on more believable matches than the guys. The guys are going out there doing all these fancy bumps and stumps, and nobody's selling anything. It's like, grab a hold, have a match, tell me a story, and the guys don't do it. I'm sorry, but that's my take on it. People say, "Well, hey, did you see this happen?" I said, "I'm sorry, I don't watch it anymore because I get angry."
Well, it's swung, right? It was about the wrestling, then it was about the wrestling and the story, and now it's really swung to the way of the story, almost a soap opera.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's always been a soap opera for guys, but
yeah.
The story's not about what happened backstage and in the dressing room. The story was always the match.
Yep.
And anyway, Brett and I, for being in the ring together for the very first time, we had one hell of a match. And basically, we both understood it was because we grew up in the culture.
That's it. And with great wrestling
Yeah.
fathers who
Yes.
taught you the right way to wrestle and make sure you could put on a great show without hurting anyone.
Yep.
And now you first came, so you've been in the wrestling game since '74. I think your first appearance was as a referee.
Yeah, I mean, I was playing college football at West Texas State University, and it's funny. Another thing about West Texas State probably graduated more professional wrestlers than football players. I mean, Dory Funk Jr., Terry Funk, myself, Tito Santana, Stan Hansen. All these guys came out. Bruiser Brody. All of us came out of West Texas State, largely due to the influence of a very famous wrestling family, the Funks.
I was just going to make mention of them because that's who you started wrestling with first, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Terry and Dory really took you under their wing to bring you into the industry. You had made mention that you were playing football at West Texas.
Yeah.
You were there on a full ride scholarship, so you've been a true athlete since early on.
Yeah. Again, I was there on a football scholarship. It's funny, I had signed a letter of intent to go to Arizona, the University of Arizona, and so I hadn't seen any wrestling. I mean, my father died on July the 2nd, 1969, in a wrestling match in Lubbock, Texas, and my whole life changed that day. My family had to move back to this little town in southern Arizona, a little town called Wilcox. 3 traffic lights.
So very small town.
Very small. And I played high school football there. I'd actually earned a scholarship. I had signed a letter of intent to go to the University of Arizona. You can sign a conference letter of intent with one team in each of the conferences. But once you sign the national letter of intent, you're done, you're committed. So I wasn't totally committed to Arizona yet. And that's when I turned on my TV one day, and there's the Funks. I hadn't seen them since my father's death, and they were coming to Tucson. So I went, saw the Funks, and Terry talked me into taking a recruiting trip to WT. He says, Ted, even if you're going to go to Arizona, take the trip, it's free, come visit us. And so I went back to West Texas State, which is just south of Amarillo, and that's all it took.
It's funny.
And I tell everybody goes, so why did you pick West Texas State over the University of Arizona? The University of Arizona is a much bigger school. I said, I really didn't go to West Texas State to play football. I went to West Texas State because I knew that was going to be my inroad to professional wrestling.
Because right after you got injured, you went with the Funks to wrestle in there. And I don't think many of the younger audience knows, but there was no national wrestling program. It was very regional.
Yeah, very regional back then. I mean, it was we called them territories. And in Canada, I don't know how many. I know one of the territories in Canada was based in Calgary.
Yep.
The Hart family, Stu Hart, and I don't know how far-reaching that was, but then I would come over here, and then to like Toronto and Montreal, and I don't know how it was split up back then, but anyway, in the United States, there were several. The state of Florida Championship Wrestling, that was one territory. The territory I started in was a big one. It was all of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and it was called Mid-South. And then there was just Georgia Championship Wrestling.
Right.
And that was an entity in and of itself. So,
and it wasn't until the mid-'80s that started to change, where you started seeing national brands like the World Wrestling Federation, of which you had joined early on in '79. I think is when you joined up with that outfit.
Well, the first time I ever went to New York was in '79. But New York, this Vince McMahon Sr. was still alive and the boss.
Yep.
It wasn't until Junior took over and he started making this national move. And I can still remember picking up a newspaper. I was in Japan, mind you. I'm in Japan. I used to go to Japan and wrestle a lot. Pro wrestling's huge in Japan. And there were two organizations, New Japan and All Japan. And I was part of All Japan. And that was like who the Funks were with and everything. I pick up this newspaper, and it says, World Wrestling Federation sets world indoor attendance record, 93,000 people at the Pontiac Silverdome. And when I saw that, I said to myself, if I'm going to stay relative in wrestling in the United States, I'm going to have to go to work for Vince McMahon. So I go home, and I had a very good friend, Bruce Pritchard. And Bruce had been Houston used to be, Houston was an entity on itself until Bill Watts bought it. But the wrestling promoter there was a guy named Paul Bosch. So anyway, but Bruce Pritchard worked for Paul. And eventually he goes, I'm getting ready to go to Japan. Bruce said, well, I'm going to fly to New York and see about getting a job. And I said, well, throw my name out there and see if anything sticks. So I go to Japan, and I come back into the hotel in Tokyo one night, and there's a message called Bruce Pritchard ASAP. I said, okay. So I called Bruce, and he said, well, a couple things have happened since you left, Ted. He says, number one, when you get back to Mid-South, Bill Watts is no longer your boss. I said, what? He sold his territory to Jim Crockett. Jim Crockett owned the promotion that was based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And he said, what was the other thing? He said, yeah, okay, Bill Watts is no longer your boss. And he sold the territory. And he says, and Vince McMahon is really interested in you. He said, don't you sign anything until you call me and you have an opportunity to talk to Vince. And so, Vince had me flew me into New York, and I get the treatment, man. The limousine ride from New York airport to Stamford, Connecticut. It's just about a 30-minute ride. And I sit down with Vince, and he says, Ted, he says, a lot of things have been done in wrestling. They've been done and redone. He says, but I've got a new idea. And he said, the one thing everybody hates is someone, by virtue of their wealth, who bullies people. They bully people with their wealth. I started laughing. I said, I can't stand guys like that myself. And he says, well, that's the nature of this character we want to make you. He says, I think you could probably be one of the hottest, most evil villains we have ever created. And I said, where do I sign? I said, I'm in, because I knew. And of course, I said, I still have an obligation to Japan for I've got to complete this tour. And he said, I want you to do whatever you got to do. He says, and then we'll get this thing rolling. And so, gosh, back then when we first started this thing, he says, I'm going to try to make people as much as possible believe you're really that guy. I said, well, how are you going to do that? He says, well, you're going to fly first class everywhere. The only other two people that got that kind of treatment were Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. Of course, Andre was so big, he couldn't sit anywhere else. Yeah. And so he said, we're going to, first class everywhere you go. He says, you ain't going to be staying in any Holiday Inns anymore. I expect you to be in the Marriott, the Hyatt, all the classy hotels. And he says, don't worry, you're going to be making the money to do it. And the limousine service, airport to hotel, hotel to Coliseum, Coliseum back to hotel, hotel back to airport. He continued to do that for almost a year. And I was like, man, again, only two other guys got that treatment, Andre and Hulk. And so, but it was the beginning of a career that, and something that I cherish to this day. I know that Vince is in a lot of trouble in a lot of ways right now. I'm a very strong Christian,
Yep.
and I pray for him on a daily basis. And whatever he's done wrong, obviously has to be accounted for. I said, but personally, I said I'm gonna be grateful to him for the rest of my life. If it hadn't been for Vince McMahon, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys, because wrestling would have never reached the plateau that it's. I mean, and it's still going.
Yep.
I went down to the developmental program, NXT, I think it was a year ago or something, and they had me do this thing with what was it, LA Knight and what was the other guy? LA Knight and Cameron Grimes. Anyway, I did this thing down in NXT, and I had a lot of fun with that. And now LA Knight's moved up and doing good. And everybody asks me that's a fan, they go, who's running the show? I said, I'm assuming that Triple H is.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. But you'll never convince me that he's not on the phone every day to Vince.
Well, it's his father-in-law, right?
Yeah,
as well. It's not too far separated. Well, I have to say, Ted, thank you so much. We've got some fans waiting here for some autos. Again, and I don't know if a lot of people know, but you were Stone Cold was your protege, so you did a lot for wrestling. I remember thinking you were the worst person in the world as a 10-year-old, thinking this guy's a dick. So it was really good. You did a really good job. So thank you for making my memories great as a kid.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted.
Happy to be here. Oh, just one more thing before you go. Always remember, everybody's got a price for the $1 Million Man.
Yes!